Today, we host a conversation with poet Diane Seuss and artist John McKaig in association with the Saginaw Art Museum's current exhibition, The Art of Poetry, Visually Reimagining the Poem. Through a unique collaboration, which we will learn about in this discussion, Seuss and McKaig connect here for a conversation about the process of creation along with other topics. John McKaig received his BFA in printmaking from Miami University and MFA in printmaking from the University of Syracuse. He is currently adjunct professor of drawing at Lycombe College in Williamsport, Pennsylvania. McKaig's work has been exhibited throughout the United States and is included in the permanent collections of Syracuse University, College of New Jersey, Auckland Print Study, Unitec Institute of Technology in Auckland, New Zealand, and many others. Diane Seuss was born in Indiana and raised in Michigan. She earned a BA from Kalamazoo College and an MSW from Western Michigan University. Seuss is the author of multiple poetry collections, including Four-Legged Girl, which made her a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. Her most recent collection, Frank Sonnets, is available through Grey Wolf Press. Her work has appeared in multiple poetry publications, including the Best American Poetry 2014. She taught at Kalamazoo College for nearly 30 years. I am here today with John McKaig and Diane Seuss. John is a visual artist and Diane is a poet. And we thought it would be interesting to talk a little bit about process and what that looks like for each of you. So let's get right into it. Obviously, there is a difference between a poem and a drawing or an illustration. But maybe, John, you can start by telling us a little bit about your process. And then, Diane, maybe you can tell us about your process. And I'll let you two talk about how those things are the same and where they might be different.
Sure.
Okay.
It's a strange thing, and I think a really interesting thing because it's not, what I was asked to do is not really a true collaboration. I think, Diane, you said something about that in our correspondence, and I totally agree with you. It's not something that we worked on together. And so someone once said to me that trying to do art about someone else's art is like trying to make cuisine about architecture. And I thought that was a good way of explaining the difficulty of it, and it's sort of, it's not ekphrastic in that way. Neither of us are explaining necessarily what the other is doing or what the other one is communicating in their art. So I think what happens for me is that I feel like my imagery of my own work is, I'm attempting to be somewhat poetic about references and train of thought and rhythm and different sections of the work. So in a sense, I can understand what somebody like Diane is doing with their writing, but it becomes a situation where I'm getting associations and then illustrating and using those kind of like that imagery in my illustration that Diane may have not ever even thought of or considered or even wanted necessarily. But, I'll let her talk about that. Diane, I'll let you talk about that. But I think it's just interesting in the sense, like if I did a piece and then I asked someone to do a poem, then I just think it's just an interesting thing. Like the thing, the ideas that I'm trying to communicate in my imagery, I can't control. After it's out in the world, people have their own kind of associations. And I think that's just the interesting part of it. It's sort of like it has an effect that you can't control. So if it went the other way, in other words, in this situation, Diane wrote the poem first, and then I did the illustration, of course. But I think if it was the other way around, I would just be incredibly intrigued about what would come out of that situation. So,
and for you, Diane, maybe you can talk through a little bit about the writing of the poem and what maybe it was like to have that poetry used in a way that perhaps you didn't intend initially. I'm not sure. Was the poem created for the purpose of the visual piece?
No, it wasn't. The poem, actually, it's called Jesus with His Cup. And it was in my third book, which is called Four-Legged Girl. And it was just one of the poems that ended up in the collection. And Kalamazoo Book Arts, then if you give a reading there, they often commission a broadside to be made from one of your poems. And this is the one that was chosen. But I've written a lot about art. My fourth book is called Still Life with Two Dead Peacocks and a Girl, which is a Rembrandt painting. And the whole book really has an ekphrastic instinct, which that's a big word, just meaning art about art. And so in my case, I got really interested in still life painting and its intersections with the place I'm from, which is Niles, Michigan, a small rural community in Southwest Lower Michigan. So how does high art intersect with what many consider low culture? A lower middle class, often working poor community. And so I got really interested in the poems with how to find a connection between, European still life and Niles, Michigan. And so when it goes the other way, which it doesn't happen that often, and when one of my poems is taken in by a visual artist and they are able to respond to it, it's always really exciting to me and always a surprise. Like, I don't have any idea about how it ought to look. I just want to see how they interact with the poem and how the images in certain ways become theirs. So it's an interesting collaboration because, art making is often a pretty solitary act. And so we're not collaborating in the traditional sense because we both make our stuff in private, but there is a kind of collaboration of the mind. Maybe that's the way to say it. And so I was just really moved. I am really moved to see what someone can do with, with my words and how that enters their imagination.
That's so interesting. I mean, I agree with everything Diane's saying here, and connecting with it. And I think, what's interesting to me about that process is that on my end is that I've done this a few times, and it's really hit or miss. Sometimes people have seen something I've done an illustration for, and they're like, "That's exactly what I was thinking," and then of course on the other end of the spectrum as well, to the point where a couple of my pieces have been rejected, not because it was so bad of a piece, but just because it didn't have any real connection to what they thought or what they were thinking about when they wrote. So I always think too, and Diane, this may be a question for you. I always think of ekphrastic writing as more sort of like art criticism, like writing about, in an art historical context. But it's interesting to me how you're talking about poetry being ekphrastic as well,
Yes.
in a better way, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, really being able to breathe it in. Actually, I was just asked to do a poem from a painting, which is at the Rhode Island School of Design in their museum. And the painting is, I think it was maybe 18th century painting of a courtesan. And, I don't want to write about it solely through an art historical perspective, but I did feel the need to do some research about who this painter was and who the subject was, if I could find out anything about her. And then to sort of take all of that in my own visual response and make it personal. So I do take that step of finding a way to find an intersection between the art and myself, or what I think about in some way. And I think you do that too. It seemed like it anyway.
Well, that's very nice. I think that's interesting too. The way, see, I don't know, I just think we're in agreement on so much. I think, I even talk to my students about this, about to really understand someone's work. I think, excuse me, you have to. Oh, I'm sorry. Excuse me. You have to, I think, look at the body of work. Like you said, you were doing some research. I think I wouldn't. It's almost like I would have preferred to read more of your writing, frankly, and it wasn't available to me. And I feel like almost, well, I just would have preferred that, and I think I would have done a better job. I am very critical, I think, of anything I put out like that. So of my own work. I mean, so.
Do you have it with you? I wondered if you could.
I have to confess, I did the block. I cut the block and sent it to Jeff at Kalamazoo Book Arts, and I haven't seen it since. So I don't even have a copy of the image or anything. So
we do that, don't we?
Yeah. We
let it go out into the world.
In a lot of ways, because I trusted Jeff Absher to do a good job, of course. And
yes, I'm sure he did. It's beautiful. Yeah. And I got them to a lot of people. It's just such an iconic piece of art in a poem that does all the things that when I look back at it, it's been a while since I wrote it. It's doing exactly what I love to do in poems, which is take this large familiar story of Jesus in the garden wanting to pass the cup and not continue along the way to crucifixion. It's not a religious poem, by the way, but that's kind of the overarching narrative, Jesus with his cup. But then what I do with it is locate that same urge or instinct in regular people, a barber and my mom and sister and me when my dad was dying when I was a kid, the mortician in town, the mayor's wife. So everybody has their cup. And so I think it was a good choice because it is kind of archetypal in that way.
Mm-hmm. You had mentioned, Diane, sort of this concept of artists working alone and the uniqueness of this type of collaboration. I would love to hear a little bit more about what it is to work alone on something, but still have that connection at the end with John. Can you talk a little bit more about that? And maybe John, you can respond as well.
Sure. Well, it came out in early March, and just seeing the responses, with social media, we're very aware now of responses to our work, and to just see that so much of what happens in a poem or a piece of art happens between the writer and the reader, or the artist and the person looking at the art. And so there's an intimacy in that relationship, even if, for instance, John and I have never spoken to each other before. And yet there we were in this moment of creation, interacting with each other. So I see it as an extension and maybe a literalization of a relationship that happens between any artist and the world.
Well, that's perfectly said, I have to say. I think the way it relates for me, sort of like when you make your art, you're playing this game, at least for me, where you want to be honest, but you also want to communicate. And so how honest do you get, And so
Yes.
in a sense, I think, doing work about Diane's poem is sort of like, I'm assuming that what I'm getting from her and vice versa is, sort of like more true than if we met each other and we're talking to each other.
Mm-hmm.
I have to say, when I'm sort of my best self, I have to say, when I'm in my studio working and coming up with ideas, it's sort of like, I feel like in social situations, I'm awkward or say the wrong thing or whatever. And I'm not really expressing myself in my best way. And so the work that comes out of my studio is something that I dwell on. So I have a sense that that sort of connection to Diane's work is maybe a truer connection than if we met and talked, frankly.
I love that. I think it's true.
Yeah.
Yeah. In fact, I just gave an interview a couple of weeks ago, and I sort of said the same thing, that the poem is a stand-in for me out in the world.
Right.
Because my tendency, even though like right now, I probably sound pretty gregarious, but I think I was born shy. And I've come up with a way of interacting with the world, but the truer self comes through in the poems.
And I think if I could add to that one more thing too, is that when I teach and I had to put on a show, kind of, but that's in a sense not really me. I love my job. I really care about my students and I care about my work, and I feel like they buy into the whole scenario, the whole sort of sense of community that's there. But it really is different than. I'm really curious in a way about how I'm seen by them, because I feel like that if they explained my sort of nature to other people, my guess is I would be like, no, that's not me at all, but
yeah. I taught for many years at Kalamazoo College, creative writing.
Yeah.
And I would often say to the students that the self that they're seeing is my public self. It's not who I am in private. And I was saying that as a way of teaching the fact that the speaker of a poem is not necessarily the poet. It's a public version of yourself or a creative version of yourself, but it's not yourself. And so, that quiet, private creator that you are, John, is the truest one probably, but that doesn't work in a classroom. You have to be able to breathe life into the ideas that you're teaching. So I'm really interested in all of that.
So so if I can even, Thor, to answer your question more extensively, I think that since Diane, I'm sort of reacting to her piece that she wrote first, and then I responded to it, so to speak. To me, that's a strange but more true conversation, in my opinion.
Yes, same. Same.
Yeah, it's interesting. As I'm listening to responses, it almost feels like the pieces that you both are creating are a bit of the difference between talking out loud and having a conversation with somebody in real time versus being able to think things through, edit them, repeat them, cross them out, start over, try again. And the idea with language is it's different when it's spoken than when it's written. Because when it's spoken, it's out and it's in the world, and you can't unspeak it. Whereas with writing, in your case, Diane, in a poem, you can cross things out and try a different word. And so there's space for that. And I imagine a similar situation plays out with your work, John. But at the end, you end up with something that's a communication of yourself in a way that is different than if you're more put on the spot and said, and having that communication, whether it be with a drawing or with a poem.
Right. And
yes.
Oh, sorry, Diane, go ahead.
No, go on. Mm-hmm.
I was just going to say that comes up a lot with my students. Like the whole idea of dwelling on something for a while and doing editing and being contemplative is kind of a foreign concept to them. They're used to Googling something and getting it right now in their life. And so they get frustrated when I'm saying, no, that's your sort of initial regurgitation. And I'm like, that's not good enough. That's sort of like, I can get that from talking to you. I want to see something deeper than that and have you think about it in a more sort of richer way or a more sophisticated way. And I think then that's, to me, why it's frustrating for me. Like, I've given talks about my work, at a gallery show or whatever. And it's, I don't want to be dismissive of other people's intent about, they want to understand the work. And I want to sort of gather them in, so to speak, into my state of mind. But I don't want to give them all the answers either, because there's something that happens, even in this situation with myself and Diane, but also from artist to viewer, that, like I said, you can't control, and but takes time, and it's reflective of that, what you're talking about, Thor, with the editing process in the studio.
Yes.
Yeah, it's incredible to sort of learn how that there's space between that's necessary when you're doing a creative process versus that immediacy that the first idea is not always the best idea or the most complete idea.
Right.
Yeah, I like what you're saying, John, about in teaching now. Probably you too, I taught over those years between no internet and
right
what it is now.
Yeah, it's a big difference now.
It's such a big difference. Yeah. And really, you're having to teach the most basic skill of moving off of the internet into an interior space that is personal. Mm-hmm. And that isn't broadcast the minute you have a thought, Mm-hmm. And that's what our
Diane, I find that I'm sorry to interrupt. I didn't mean to that.
No, go on. It's fine.
I was saying really quick that if you give them time to do it, they buy into it, though. You know what I'm saying?
Yep. Yes. That's why arts education is so crucial.
Yeah.
Maybe now more than ever.
Yeah.
To give students that experience. Mm. I used to be asked, well, do you want a smart classroom? And I'd say, no, I want the dumbest classroom you've got. Like a room where we can sit in a circle and look at each other. That's the room I want.
Yeah.
Because, they don't get that experience too much anymore.
Right. Almost like not efficient, but better.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yes. The beauty of inefficiency.
Right.
Yes.
Because then it's also more democratic in a good way too. In other words, it's not me just sort of giving a presentation and saying, "Okay, go do this," and then come back a week later and connect on Zoom like this. When I'm in the studio with them, it's so much richer and
yes, it's an interaction. It's human.
Yeah.
And trying to stay human now is a struggle.
Yeah.
Helping them find models for that. I think that's what education is. I don't know how we got onto that, but
well, I don't know. I sort of feel like you're going to have to start charging me tuition if you keep going.
Okay.
I'm a little curious about the way that art is finished. In your case, Diane, when you finished writing this poem, it was finished without the expectation that John would be creating his artwork.
Right.
So in a way, it was continued on in a different form.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a little curious about your feeling about that, and whether when you decide a poem might be ready for the world or ready to be finished. And maybe John, you can comment on that as well with your printmaking. When is it done? Is it ever done, or does it just carry into the world in a different form?
It's a really good question. I do have a sense of completion with the poem, and I think it is. There's just that feeling. It's like when a bracelet clicks shut. There's something that maybe I've struggled over it a bit, or I've toiled with it, and click, something comes right. And I couldn't really say what it is. I mean, maybe for this poem, I was kind of surprised. I always feel that it's important to not know where you're going with a poem, to not walk into a poem thinking, oh, it's going to be about blank and I'll end up here. If you have that, you might as well not write the thing. So I like the process being mysterious and kind of following it rather than controlling it. And so usually that takes me to a place I didn't expect. And when I hit that place, it feels done. I might tweak things in revision, but there's something I've arrived at, a particular mystery that just feels right. So then when that goes into the world, and for instance, when John worked with, I feel like that is his art, and it isn't an extension of the process of my process. It's his process in interaction. It's intimate, but it's his. So that's how I view it.
I think my comments will echo what you just said, Diane, but I think it's a lot of things going on at the same time. So let me explain. So one of them is like, I don't know, I'm not sure what this quote comes from, but it's been quoted to Matisse, I think. But the work never ends; it only stops at interesting places.
Yes.
And so I do, though, I think I've developed a sense of sort of my reputation in a way where the image needs to be resolved, but it always feeds into something afterwards. And so my students, for example, I relate so much of this to what I talk about with my students, I have to say.
Yes.
They don't want to put everything in it. And I'll be like, no, that's a body of work says it, not, you don't have to shove everything into each image.
Yes.
And
yes.
so I think they spend too much time stressing about wanting to knock us over the head with the meaning. And I'm like, well, the meaning is going to come across if you're working and you're thinking and you're not over analyzing, but you're making sure that you're still working, then it'll come across and you won't be able to help it. And so when I'm finished with the piece, I've already got, I don't know about Diane, but I have no lack of ideas. I've got a lifetime of ideas.
Yes.
It comes from work. And that's a John Cage thing. Work comes from work, not from analysis.
Yes. Yes.
And so I think that the finish thing is not even something I'm thinking about. I'm always thinking about the next thing. And okay, this one image might be completed or resolved. And I feel that I can put my name on it, so to speak. But I'm always thinking about, I don't even look at my old pieces that much. They're out there, and I'm always thinking about the next thing because I want to keep going with that idea, or I've got a new idea.
Yes, I experience it similarly. It's it reminds me of like cicada shells. You leave the shell of the poem or the print behind and move into the next.
Right.
So really, it's a lifelong journey that you live from piece to piece.
Yeah.
And you're always walking into the mystery.
And I have to say, Thor, one more thing. There's like this level, I think, of being older. I have to say, when you're younger, you're sort of clear cut. I want this, But the mystery that Diane's talking about, I think, happens when you're when you're older and you're not, frankly, as sure about things in a lot of ways. It's almost like more important to not know where a piece is going.
Yes.
And it's almost essential. Whereas before, I had a clear idea, but I have to say the work isn't as good, as it is now because of
that.
Yeah.
Well, I want to thank you both for this interesting discussion, John, Diane. Very, very revealing. I'm so glad that I could connect the two of you and could have this conversation.
Yes, thanks for having us. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much. I'm really grateful. It's nice to meet you both, so to speak.
Yes. And, I love Saginaw because it's the birthplace of Theodore Retke, who's a poet whose work I love. I've read at his house there.
Yes.
And I'm actually working on a poem about him right now.
Diane, I know I'm putting you a little bit on the spot. Would you be willing to read Jesus with His Cup?
Oh, yeah, I'm happy to.
That would be great.
Yeah. Jesus with his cup. The barber with his mug of warm foam, his badger hairbrush. My mother and sister and me and the dog, leashed with a measure of anchor rope in the hospital parking lot, waving goodbye to my father from his window on the 7th floor. Just him and his tumor, rare as the Hope diamond, and his flimsy paper cup, half filled with infirmary water. The lump in my throat, a tea party cup left in the garage all winter, holding the silver body and wing dust of a dead moth. The barber sweeping the day's worth of hair into the basement, remembering how he'd traveled to Memorial to lather the face of the dying man and shave him smooth in his raised hospital bed, and how sometimes he shaved the faces of the dead as a favor to the mortician. Wondering how this particular life was the life that had been chosen for him. The barber walking home in the dark to a late supper of torn bread and a cup of heavy cream. Even the mayor's wife, sipping from a teacup, wreathed in banded peacock butterflies, wonders in her loneliness, why me? Why this cup?
Wow, bravo, Diane.
Thank you. Thanks.
Yeah, it's great.
Thank you for listening to the Saginaw Art Museum podcast. You can stay connected with the museum through our website and social media channels. We invite you to become a subscriber of this podcast or become a monthly contributor to the show to help us carry out our mission of providing art for all.